Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to our next episode of Decoding AQ. With me at her morning, my afternoon, I have Sarah Ratekin. She is a business owner and chief happiness officer. So an employee experience champion in a happy place when she is making the complex simple, especially in and around belonging, inclusion, diversity and equity. So driving that workforce transformation. She's a sought after keynote speaker and author. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Ross. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
So this example of being passionate about employee experience, we hear a lot about these types of concepts and words and all the different levels of organization, but you, as I understand, really love building sustainability in the environment that's very nurturing, where people truly feel valued, they feel respected and trusted, an interesting word, trusted to do their best. The book that you wrote was Silver Threads, Living a Life of Gratitude, and also the companion to Silver Threads, which is the Positivity and Gratitude Journal. A Navy veteran, holds lots of education, a Doctor of Business Administration, focus on how intentional gratitude impacts organizational performance. So this blend of being a researcher, liking data, a realist, knowing that how do we get data to drive more holistic and rounded stories within that context of being good decisions. So where I want to start off, Sarah, is what led you from the Navy into the environment of through sales, marketing, and then into an author, speaker, and helping people find organizational happiness?
Ross, I would say that anybody of my generation would agree that being in the military was not necessarily a place where happiness was considered part of the equation. And that was just real. And even today, there are a number of voices who would argue that the workplace is meant to be what it is, unpleasant, but a necessary evil. You get a paycheck, and therefore that should be sufficient to sustain you through your lifespan as a functional member of the economy, right? And the reality is that is not true. That has never really been true, but we are seeing more and more, especially as we see new waves of generations entering the workforce, that those expectations are outdated and have to adapt to best accommodate the needs of both the individuals doing the work and the organizations sponsoring the work. My own personal journey was kind of what they call the squiggly path. I left the service and then bounced around a number of different corporate roles. I'm grateful for those experiences because they gave me a broader visibility to what happens inside of organizations. So I've worked on the manufacturing floor, I've worked in the corporate offices, and just about everything in between. And what I saw was a really common theme of people really loathing their day jobs. And I'm sure I'm not alone. I had a number of colleagues who were clinically miserable, medicated to deal with the unpleasantness that was their workplace. And even a couple of times had some immediate connections in my environment who chose to end their own lives because their work environment was so stressful or so awful. And that just didn't sit well with me. So randomly, or maybe not so randomly, maybe the universe has plans for us. I was working on my first master's degree and I happened to run across Sean Akers' TED Talk, The Happiness Advantage, and it changed everything for me. It was really the pivotal moment where I took what had been a personal practice of experiencing gratitude intentionally to navigate personal challenges into the realm of, I wonder if this is something that we could do at a more scalable level. Like, can organizations embrace this? So it took me a little while to get there. It took me a long while to convince an academic committee to agree that this was worth researching. But once we did, and we got into that space, everybody I interacted with was just blown away in pretty profound ways. And I'm excited to continue that work and, more importantly, have positive opportunities to impact the way organizations think about the workplace.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because society winding back, we put a lot of effort and research into understanding the negative side of society, of depression, of anxiety, of mental illness, mental health. And yet it wasn't till later on that we then thought, well, maybe we should study the opposite of that. Study, Seligman's study positivity, study happiness, and the balance between what is genetics, what's environment, what is it that we can actually control and influence in our environment, people around us, the information we consume, the information we display out, the narratives and stories that we give ourselves and to each other. So I'm interested in terms of how, from an organizational perspective, it looks at having a chief happiness officer. Where does that sit? What does it look like? What are the responsibilities? And is it just a different name for something that existed, or is this really a defined area that people need to consider deeply in their organization?
I would say in the States, this is a virtually unexplored territory. And I think that really does lend itself to that sort of approach to the workplace. Like, work is where you go to work and be miserable, and then that's how you pay for your happy life outside of work, which doesn't really work out very well. I think there is a bigger landscape for this within European countries, partly due to employment law and employee well-being regulations and things of that nature. I do not think that most organizations currently have somebody who really focuses on this, or if they do, it's a very junior level associate who is tasked with really being kind of the party planner. Which is an important job, but it is not the same approach as chief happiness officer. So there are a couple of different organizations who do this work, this chief happiness officer training and these conversations. And the focus is not on party planning, which many people think it is, but it's really, really understanding what is the scientific background, what is the research, what are our data points as an organization that point to the things that do or don't drive employee engagement, and how do we sustainably incorporate those opportunities into the ecosystem of our organization in a way that drives meaningful change in an environment where employees tend to not stick around for 30 years. That is the real landscape that we are dealing with. And a lot of organizations struggle with investing in people that they don't think they're going to keep for 20 years. But I think it's more along the lines of relationship development. And when companies do this work, it all too often sits within human resources. And I have some mixed feelings about that, because the truth is the vast majority, somewhere between 2/3 and virtually all, depending on the organization, of employees simply don't trust human resources. And that's a sad reality. I think there's some movement in the HR space to address that friction point. But the reality is nobody really wants to see HR come into the room, and they don't trust that that person is there to make their life better. When I've done this work for organizations, it has never really been called a chief happiness officer. It's been called an employee resilience coordinator or employee experience manager or something like that. But that's not really the same conversation, right? It's not a strategic opportunity to review what an organization is doing in partnership with the employees to create these manageable spaces that really do drive transformational improvements. I think in a perfect environment that this role would sit in an operational lane and under the operations lens, because that's really what it is. It is the operations of the organization. And I think it gets away from that negative stigma that is unfortunately carried by all too many of our HR colleagues.
It is a challenge, isn't it, when we're dealing with ingrained beliefs and ingrained kind of processes and perceptions of both ourselves, teams, departments, way things should be. You mentioned it earlier on. Work equals uncomfortable. We just tolerate it. We have to do it. And every so often you might get something where, the odd day that gives you the boost. So in practical terms, the companies that you've worked with, I'm curious as to understand what is the perception shift around the relationship of that experience of work. Is it that me as an individual, if I'm passionate about something, I can bear almost any pain, anyhow. So is it about aligning something to what I care about, and then I change my feeling towards it and I feel happier because it's, the juice is worth the squeeze, the effort's worth the end result? Or is it about reshifting what I do and how I do it? If I'm not happy, is that an excuse? Hey, this doesn't make me happy, so I don't want to do it, Sarah. Find me something that makes me happy. How do you balance that from the theory and concept? I'm up for it. I'll get onto a little bit later what we try and do with this, but I'm interested in those friction points where it might be a challenge.
I think the answer is yes, and I think there is an opportunity to change the way we think about the work and how we communicate that to the people doing the work. So there really are only two levers that drive employee satisfaction. This is the secret formula that I give away to everybody. If you can get these things right, your people will find more fulfillment in the workplace and in our personal lives, honestly. So the two things are, do people understand, and I mean truly understand, how the energy they're expending has a meaningful impact either on the company or the community or the stakeholders that they care about? Like, what is that mission connection point for them? And more importantly, do they have good relationships in the environment in which they are spending their time? So that doesn't mean that people need to have best friends necessarily in the office, but they should have one or two meaningful relationships built either with colleagues or with customers, vendors. It could even be the barista on the corner where they get their morning cup of coffee before they come in. But having those positive relationships is a crucial piece of that employee engagement space. And that is even more important in today's environment where many people are still working either fully remote or in a deeply hybrid mode. Even for introverts, there's this sort of trope of introverts don't like people, and that is absolutely not true. It's just how people recharge their batteries. But I think we have to create those spaces where people can develop those relationships and then connect that energy that they're spending back to something meaningful. The trick to that is a lot of organizations that I've seen talk about purpose-driven work almost use that in an abusive fashion. Oh, it's heart-centered, so you will put up with just about anything and getting paid pennies on the dollar for what your time is actually worth. So I want to be really mindful that we don't maliciously use this concept to create what is still a very toxic environment, but rather look at ways that you can better communicate the work that you're doing, better understand the why for both the organization and the individual. And that can be as simple as helping people understand what are your personal values and how do those connect or not with the current role that you're in. And then to your point, Ross, can you shape the way that the work is being done? I mean, the work has to get done somehow, right? But I think we see, well, I know we see that a lot of times organizations have sort of carved a rut in the road in how things are to be done. And even in deeply, deeply regulated industries, there is still space to reconsider the process by which that happens. And wouldn't it be nice if we actually incorporated into that conversation the people who do that work on a daily basis and probably have thought, wow, this friction point would be so much less irritating if XYZ. We too often leave out those really important stakeholders, the actual doers, in those conversations and how we shape the processes and the procedures in which we do things. And when we have that autonomy and that opportunity to have buy-in into how something is done, we feel more invested in that space, which immediately takes away some of that feeling of helplessness. And humans do not like at all feeling helpless. It creates discomfort in our psyche. So stop doing that. We can choose to do a better thing.
So if we can create an understanding of that connection between my own energy and efforts, the connection to the outcome and impact, if I can see that connection, that's one part of the puzzle that I've identified. The other part is then the connection to another human being. Now, can that connection, that even though I might have a really great connection with them, can that result in the opposite of happiness? I'm connected to this person because we're both miserable, but I'm really connected. If you take away that connection from this pocket of, miserable people that moan about the same thing, oh, my boss does this, the company does this, but what we're doing, it's slow. So is there a way when we're adapting and changing that we can maybe step out of some of the connections that have kept us to the identity of insert whatever it might be, a victim, I'm this person, we do this role, it doesn't really matter, to say, no, it does matter. What I'm doing does count. And I can see that. where, because I know from own experiences working within companies where we can almost create this little cliques, little bubbles of team members that are comfortable in their own discomfort, and it's become part of their identity, and breaking out from that is quite unfamiliar, scary, and they like being in that other place. And for them, maybe that's part of their happiness, is to be unhappy. I don't know. What's your thought around that?
They might be comfortable. I'm not sure they're happy. Although I want to pause and say I don't believe that happiness should be the goal. I never say that actually. But happiness is more the way we gauge how things are going. So other things should really be your driving North Star. But what I see in those spaces is I see this on social media right now quite a bit, the concept of trauma bonding, right? And that is true. That does happen. Shared misery actually is a very strong connector for people. We are dealing with this trash together. We're in this together. Lots of organizations, including the military, use that concept to drive strong team building. The trick is that the trauma should probably not be caused by your organization, at least not intentionally. I mean, trauma will happen, stress will happen, life will life. But how we navigate through that is certainly very important. So the answer to your question is yes, that does happen. And yes, that is actually fairly common, especially in, I think, high stress industries where that becomes a badge of honor, almost that martyrdom complex of we are suffering together. And I would argue that's part of at least the American mindset towards work is we are suffering in this together, but it'll be worth it someday. Of course, most people die before they get to retirement or shortly thereafter. So I'm not sure that math really works out. So sometimes we have to go through uncomfortable periods of life to get to better spaces. Of course, just because we are human, those better spaces also typically it's not a happily ever after situation. We don't have the luxury of reaching the promised land and everything is perfect from that point forward. What happens though in those spaces is we develop the skills for navigating through difficult situations. That's really what resilience is, right? It's why resilience doesn't happen academically. Resilience happens tactically. So we can develop those skills that let us hit the next barrier, the next situation, the next chaos point with a little bit more knowledge, if nothing else, the knowledge that we will make it through with minimal trauma if we do XYZ to get there. But I think when you see those pockets, what you've really identified is kind of a little pocket of infection within your organization, and you have to figure out how you're going to treat that.
Yeah. How do you elevate that opportunity for them to come out of it when it's very hard to see when you're inside it, right? And I think we're dealing with a lot of ingrained elements, work. Oh, it must be hard. If I haven't worked hard, I haven't done a good job, and each of these things. Or if it was easy, then is it right? Or have I been skiving if I haven't worked long hours or hard? And like you say, it's a very complex situation of transformation that we're going through at the moment in terms of geopolitical, global change, technological change that's just redefining the social contracts of employment. And I think there is a huge opportunity we have right now to say, instead of, oh, I'll pass that over there to somebody else who might want to do it, might be another country, might be another department, might be another diverse society that, hey, maybe it's their turn to take on that role. That maybe a lot of those things can go to inanimate software, technology, and then release us. And that opportunity to rewrite the definition and the contract of what work means, like you said, it's not, oh, I do this and then later on I'm happy, or the promised land, I'll retire when I'm happy. Why can't each moment, each day have that element inside? So I want to touch on the piece around gratitude. And you've already mentioned some skills, resilience, about bringing up our ability to face adversity or challenges, to cope or to transform through those traumatic situations, stressful situations. How does gratitude feed into that?
So gratitude at its core is really the acknowledgement that somebody or something else created a positive experience or beneficial experience for us. That's what it boils down to. So in our cultures, most developed nations and people I've talked to across the globe, honestly, gratitude is an interesting, complicated space like everything else in life. But it has really morphed away from that connection point and into a transactional expectation. So it's kind of like the tell your grandmother you love the ugly sweater. Well, you probably don't love the ugly sweater. So forcing people to express gratitude, that's not actual gratitude, right? We're performing an action that has no emotional connection, and in fact might be creating some emotional friction underneath it. Like, I hate the sweater, I don't want to tell grandma thank you for that, and I'm not wearing that dang thing to school, right? So how do we go back to what it really is? So when I talk about gratitude, it's really going back to acknowledging where is that positive experience for you. And even if it is an ugly sweater, the point might be that your grandmother thought enough about you to do something nice for you. You might not ever plan to wear that sweater, but you can still pause and appreciate that person meant well, like the intentions were still positive. And that's complicated and can get really messy. So we'll save that for another conversation. But how do we do that in the workplace, right? And I think what we see is a lot of times people are very, very keen to position themselves as the lone soldier, forging ahead, climbing the mountain, doing the things by themselves. Cool. That's neither true nor helpful. None of us are self-made, right? We've all depended upon a tremendous amount of effort, energy, and experiences of other people to bring us to the place where we are, which in no way negates the effort that we spend to do whatever it is that we've accomplished. It's a mutually beneficial experience. So how do we teach ourselves to pause in a world that has taught us to keep racing in the rat race? We're all probably on amygdala hijack. We're all very stressed out. Burnout is catastrophically prevalent within just about every corner of the universe at this point. And the brain likes the negative. Well, the brain at least is comfortable thinking about the negative. It's a biological survival technique to scan the horizon for the saber-toothed tiger to avoid getting eaten. And in today's world, the cell phone notifications and the email things that pop up, they keep us on that razor's edge of stress. So gratitude gives us a chance, especially when it's intentional, to pause and kind of calm that chaos and put just a little bit of balance back into the algorithm of our daily life. So when we talk about gratitude, it is not meant to be like a 3-hour-long meditation cycle where you sit and ponder all of the beautiful things that have happened. You can, I mean, by all means, if you have the capacity to do that, please do. But it can be as simple as 1 or 2 minutes of just pausing and thinking about something that happened in your recent memory where somebody made your world a little bit better. And when we experience gratitude, typically, how we're taught to think about it is only for the big things. Like something has to be worthy of our gratitude to earn a spot on our dance card for the day, which is already packed full of way too much stuff. So we wait to experience gratitude until something major happens, a really large business deal or a huge promotion or graduating from university or whatever the thing is that we've pinned our hopes on to make life better. And then we might allow ourselves to be grateful for about 30 seconds before we're off to the next thing that's supposedly going to bring us joy that we never really get to. So when we pause for those few moments and when we make it a practice, what we're doing is teaching our brain to add into its constant scan for the dangerous saber-toothed tiger, to also scratch through the things that are happening and pay attention to the good stuff that's happening too. Because you're never going to turn off that part of your brain. And if you could, you'd probably be at really big risk for getting hit by a car or something. Like, we need that danger system to keep us alive. But we also have to be really mindful of the positive stuff. And I think the most recent estimate is that the human brain processes like 34 gigabytes of information every day. I promise statistically that there are at least 3 things in that crazy amount of information that are positive, beneficial, or some way joy-inducing. So watch for them, just kind of keep an eye out for them. And when they happen, give them a little, hey, that was cool. And that is like an Alka-Seltzer for the chaos that's always bubbling in our brains, right? It brings down the stress, it brings down the chaos that we're always experiencing, and it allows us to recognize that there is more than just misery in our lives. But more importantly, it reconnects us to other people. And I think that is a huge piece of why gratitude is so powerful, is that reconnection.
It's interesting, isn't it, where we are trying to find these moments to smell the roses, or to the Ken Blanchett, catch it in the moment. And
Mhm.
it can be small, you know, the 1 minute manager, all of these sort of little elements that have been seeded in when, as you said, we're just running. We're just so fast that just to take a breath, to take a moment is difficult. And that becomes a practice, but it also, I think, can become contagious and
Yeah.
positively contagious for yourself and others by showing that you give permission to yourself to do that, share it, that others might have permission. And then we can shift maybe to the level where we start to go from privately the reflection of grandma's jumper to having courageous, candid conversations with others that we care about. Because where was the responsibility in that, that the grandma was not connected to you to know what would give you joy, and the responsibility to communicate before those events are part of that feedback loop, aren't they? So I think the opportunity in the workplace is to, yes, recognize, start sharing, and build that muscle of the gratitude awareness
Mhm.
signal from our amygdala signal, and then be brave enough and courageous enough to give that candid feedback that isn't then hit with a, oh, I've disconnected. No, what I've done is I've connected even deeper on a lower level. If we try and do that too early, I think it can be counterproductive. So with organizations that you're working with, what are some of the steps they kind of go through typically with the work that you do to bring awareness to some of these areas? Is it in through diversity conversations? Is it in through, belonging conversations? Is it in, I've got this problem, Sarah, we're hemorrhaging talent. How can you help me? Where does it tend to start with? Is it challenges? Is it aspirations? And what is sort of some of the first steps of your process that maybe helps us to think about it?
Usually, unfortunately, it is when an organization is in crisis and they are hemorrhaging talent. And that is all too common in today's world. And I think it's unfortunate because if you pay attention to the signals early, or if you are very intentional, I have a couple of clients who have had negative experiences and started their businesses and wanted to have a different way forward. But all too often it's the crisis response, right? We are losing, having brain drain, we cannot keep people, we can't get managers to get promoted, they don't want the job, what's wrong. And right, they're not alone in that. What do we see? The most recent Gallup number was something like $8 trillion a year is lost to the global economy due to employee disengagement. And that's not even turnover. That's literally just employed people who don't care enough to give their full effort. And can you blame them when it's so miserable in their workplaces? So they kind of come to a place of crisis, and then they're drowning, reaching out for anybody they think that can help offer them a different way of thinking about it. But it is change, right? And change, as anybody who's worked in the change space knows, that change is so hard. So the first step is really convincing senior leadership that they have to be a part of those conversations. It is an interesting phenomenon that most organizations would prefer to bring in an outside person, a consultant or somebody like that, to work with their teams, because I think it gives them like plausible deniability, or if it doesn't work, it's not their fault. But that kind of change is structural. I mean, it's at the core of an organization. If you're changing how you think about work, that's not changing your letterhead. That's a big functional cultural change. And you have to have buy-in and demonstration of that change by senior leaders. So the first step is really usually convincing those people you have to come along for the ride. Your people are watching you to see how you react to these changes. And if the senior leadership is kind of rolling their eyes or just choosing not to engage, then they won't either. And that's true for everything. Lots of companies do things like build a fitness center on the campus, but then the executives are never seen in there using the equipment. So nobody's going to go because successful people don't go to the gym, or successful people don't go to the yoga class or the meditation session, or whatever the thing is that they've dropped into their wellness initiatives to try to fix things. Well, if they're not doing it, why would the individual contributors choose to do that, and then thereby to be seen as less dedicated to the work than the senior executives who are too busy to partake in these well-being initiatives. So the first step is getting that buy-in, and then it is understanding what exactly are you trying to change here. Like you can't boil the ocean, as they say. So this change is going to be difficult. It is probably going to annoy people who are, to our earlier conversation, who are invested in the status quo. So what's in it for them? What is the return on investment for people who you are asking to go on this journey of sometimes pretty difficult change? I mean, even if it's positive change, it's still deeply stressful, and we have enough stress. People don't want to add more to their plate. So being really clear in the work that you're trying to accomplish and pausing periodically to allow those changes to kind of coalesce into the new way of doing things is also a key component. Otherwise, you're just throwing things at the wall, hoping something sticks, and it almost never does.
When people are in this heightened crisis mode, we're not good at making decisions. We know this. And so that might be very hard. You know, you're coming in late. Wouldn't it be nice? Yeah, we get in upstream and we start to identify things earlier. But the reality is society says fix when it's broken most of the time, and don't fix what isn't broken. And we do a few things at the edges. If we've got that, Sarah, if we've got buy-in, if the leadership team are really in, they just want some help, and they recognize this isn't the environment they're wanting, they want to make steps towards it. What are some of the first things that aren't, say, the obvious ones, as you mentioned a few of these well-being things of these grand gesture of, okay, we're going to do X, we're going to have this event, this party, these yoga, these activities. What's the stuff in the messy middle that can really start to help sort of re-engineering that perception of work? What are some of those conversations? What are some of those initiatives that aren't maybe the big showy parts, but maybe, hey, Sarah, we've got a challenge this next week, a deadline's hitting us. How do we approach that differently than we might have done before? That isn't, I've got to go to a meditation, got to go to this. I've got a big deadline, end of the week. I'm going to the Lake District the week after. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm not happy about it. How can we deal with that, Sarah? What would you say to somebody who's in those sorts of messy middle moments?
What I say to the leaders is let's pause and take a deep breath. And I mean that very literally. I don't mean that as a metaphor, because all too often we are in this crisis mode and the brain is not engaged. And at that point, there's really no point in making decisions on what to do next because you're not making good decisions. So I will actually often take my senior leaders who have bought into this, or at least are being dragged along for the ride unwillingly, and do a session with them on some stress triage. Because the truth is, until they can come off of that razor's edge of chaos, they're not going to be able to communicate well to their teams why this change is happening. They're going to give off negative signals. So we got to get them really in a better position to be able to have those conversations. And so having some whatever it works for them. And it's an interesting space. There is not a single bolus of mechanisms that will fix every team, right? Every team is a unique organism unto itself. So doing a quick analysis of what are the friction points or the stoppers for those particular individuals is really important to understand why they may be resistant to this conversation. And then working with them. And it doesn't, I mean, I say working with them, and it's not, again, like a silver bullet, right? You can't just drop something into the water and everybody's magically better. But when you're going to have that frank conversation and say, okay, this is going to be an interesting journey, it's going to be a little bumpy, that's okay. But we're going to take time to pause periodically and regroup and think about what's happening. Why is this happening? Why are we doing this? Because it's an intentional thing, right? You're choosing to intentionally disrupt something that exists. And so you have to kind of have that structured approach to that. Otherwise, if it's a new sort of chaos, and that doesn't lend itself well to positive results. So you have to do a lot of reshaping of the conversation and reminders of why are we doing this? What are the outcomes we're shooting for? And it's much like, I mean, I do think of it as treating an illness, honestly. So when I use the term organizational inflammation a lot, because we have friction points that have built up in these spaces, and calcification of behaviors or whatever that have created these tight spots in organizations, and the work can't flow as it ought to, or as it could optimally. So how do we de-stress everybody? How do we bring down that inflammation? And much like going to the chiropractor, you don't go once and all of a sudden you're magically better. It takes time to do that, but it also helps to remind yourself that you're doing it for the right reasons. And I think most importantly, do you set some short-term goals? I certainly hope so, because change transformation is a long-term project. It is not a 6-week or even a 6-month process usually, which doesn't mean you have to retain a consultant for the next 20 years, but identify the fact that there are going to be short-term wins, and then they're going to be longer-term goals. And hopefully, if you've done your homework, that whole strategy aligns really nicely, and those short-term wins scaffold up to those longer initiatives, so that you can see that change building gradually over time.
I guess some of the opportunity is within the design of the work. Everything's a project, the project management of these things, where historically it was all about how we've got to be lean, we've got to be efficient, we've got to look at the data, and we've got to maximize every moment of underutilized capacity and capability. And we max the system out, whether it's a machine or it's a human being. And maybe now, because we're going through the aftermath of that, and the reorganization of the frequency of the world, of life, of work, of all of these things, is just to be able to redesign that with those pause moments embedded, to rethink, to reimagine, to reestablish, because we can't do it along the way. And it's so hard, isn't it? Because the car's running and it's going along. We can't come off outside, park up and do a little bit, but we need that. We need the pit stops and not think we're going to lose the race. So I think it's this speed and perception. And I talk about it a lot, train a lot of people around this exponential pace of change. Just to keep up, you've got to run as fast as you can. The Alice in Wonderland kind of thinking is, we can take a moment of pause. We can take those moments, build it into the process, build it into the system, that we can have moments of reflection, moments of play, moments of experimentation, to allow us to just elevate out of that. As we come to the next piece, actually, I'll let you reflect on that first, and then I'll pose the next piece. Sarah, what's your thinking around that?
Well, you really bubbled something up for me. I think we do think that, right? We should just run the car all the time, but even our cars have to have oil changes and tire changes, and even top race car drivers do take pit stops, because their vehicle will literally explode if they don't treat it properly. So I think we have to really reconsider what is the sprint of our work, and where are those natural pause points, because otherwise you are literally going to burn your people out, and that's what we're seeing today.
Yeah, we're trying to do a 24-hour Le Mans every day, not once a year.
No sleep, too much coffee.
And so, those cars, those bits, the teams, the support around to function at that capacity for that period of time need moments of back in the workshop, back in the preparation, in all of those sorts of things. And so I think it's around just the rhythm and the cadence that a lot of things sustained over a long period for the same people gives us chronic issues. Whereas hard all in for a moment can be incredibly empowering, as long as we have the space to actually take the energy. And I remember one of the big changes for me about 10 years ago was holidays and time off was the reward for good work. That was my perception before. Whereas I re-engineered that thought to, no, the time off and holiday is the enabler of the good work. And just that little shift changed how I run the business and the teams that I've worked with over the years, is that you take that first to do the good work, not well done, now you can take the time off because you're so blooming spent. You're just going to spend the time in bed as a zombie. So I want to give a couple of pieces as we come to the witching hour of the podcast, Sarah. And this is really in this idea where you've mentioned happiness as an organizational advantage, and how thinking about this in the operations department and operations area, who would be the person that would be the ideal one that needs to go, Yes. Is that the COO? Is it a maverick person who's in charge of a department that's looking at changing the operation of that, and you start in that sort of area? Where would you look at as an opportunity first? And then has there been a story that you can share where this is really refined and changed? Like you said, it's an ongoing life's journey, but in the experience of running a project with them, can you just highlight that with a story of, okay, went in here, this was the challenge they were facing, we did some of these activities, and this is where they're at now in their journey, just so it can be brought to life a little bit?
I think that given the fact that happiness in the workplace is such a foreign concept for most organizations, although I would love to see a C-suite to come to me and say, we want this to happen, that's not likely, right? So I think you do need that free thinker, that out-of-the-box innovator who recognizes that they want better for their team. And in my experience, it's usually somebody who actually has a team that's working okay, but they can see the potential and they want to optimize them and take them up to that next level of performance without burning them out. So that's sort of my perfect person to work with, because they're already excited about the concept and they're willing to do things a little bit differently. And they can serve as a case study for their organization, which lends me to the story I'll share with you. So I was new to this work actually, and I was working with a team in a large global pharmaceutical company. And they were an interesting creature because this particular team worked on a different type of product than the entire rest of the organization. So they fell under different regulatory requirements and everything, but the entire business model was built around the far more cumbersome model. And this is how we do things. This is our risk requirements. This is our quality requirements, even though it had nothing to do with the team I was working with. And so it was creating all kinds of friction and irritation and honestly lack of opportunity, because the competitors were operating under the leaner requirements, but the big business couldn't get its head around that space. So the leader of that team was like, this is terrible. Our team is super unhappy. They're not engaged in their endeavors. I know these are brilliant researchers. I want to really tap into that. And so we did a lot of work around, first of all, understanding and empowering that team to speak up for what they knew was right. I mean, they were subject matter experts in their area, but they didn't feel that way because of their comparison to the rest of the organization. They hadn't been doing that work. They would probably never do that work. So we taught them things like how to have crucial conversations, to speak up for themselves, to be able to adapt to a no and not take it as a hard no, and bring that case forward with the just as much rigor in that research as they would give to their actual product research. And it really changed the way they approached the work. But I think more importantly, what happened is they saw themselves within the team as allies in this grand mission. And so those relationships really started to coalesce. And this is where we saw the power of those positive relationships. And I think it's helpful to note that this team actually no longer works together. That business was spun off into its own company, and those people have scattered to the wind since then. But while they were working, they managed to change the culture of the larger company. They got a whole separate line of requirements built into the documentation to allow them to do the work that they knew they could do. And it brought a tremendous amount of, honestly, money into the organization because they were able to get to the market faster. They were able to accomplish these really lofty goals that the organization had for them without all of that frustration of you're doing it wrong. They weren't doing it wrong. They were doing it perfectly for their space. So being able to become then the good guys in the organization was really exciting for them. And they went from, in a span of 6 months, they went from being the least engaged on the employee pulse survey to the most engaged on the employee pulse survey, which was a change of about 60 percentage points, which was massive, honestly. But also they became advocates for that approach to work within the organization. So many of them sat in committees that spanned both sides of the business. They sat in organizations outside of the business, areas of expertise that were industry wide, and they brought that mindset with them, and they began positioning themselves as thought leaders, not just in their areas of scientific expertise, but also in how they approached work. And people were drawn to that because we like to be around people who are confident and positive, and this team had really created that archetype for themselves, and they were living in that space. So it's a fascinating example of how really it didn't take much other than a couple of shifts in how their senior leadership empowered them to let them blossom into the people that they could be. And I'm still connected to many of them, and I watch the things that they're doing, and it is just amazing to me how they went from these sort of downtrodden, whatever, this is my career now, to excited and engaged leaders in their spaces. And I'm just really jazzed about that.
It's great, isn't it, when we can gain the energy from seeing overcoming something that doesn't function, doesn't work. And it was put in place for all legitimate reasons at the point it was put in place. But things shift, and we need that bravery. We need those people to reimagine those processes. And that does take an environment of trust, of permission. And when we have, this utopia of everybody's all in alignment, actually the reality is that there's going to be sparks of different directions, of different pieces, and we might not know at the initial point how they connect, but we need to just imagine, let's discover, let's see what might be possible, what might reveal itself of a new way. As you mentioned, regulation is a really interesting one, as it shifts and it can drive change in many different ways. There's lots of organizations and business models that aren't regulated and should be. We've got technology at the moment where how do we regulate some of these things? And it's going off in all sorts of areas. And we've got the both joy and excitement and misery and sharp objects. And, we only have to watch different movie takes of different directors from a dystopia to a utopia. That's the reality we're in right now. And so we need to be conscious. We need to be having these difficult conversations and allow people to discover what the possibilities are if the heart is in the right place. Are we looking to improve society? Are we looking to improve the climate, the planet, all of these big pieces, even if it's my own little effort of what I do that I can contribute to it? So it's been really interesting to get under the skin of something that could be batted off by somebody of, that's just another buzzword phase, to no, what are the real realities here? How can we use this to drive societal shifts and change in organizations? Started with little pockets of brave people, that can ripple effect. And that's how we progress, right, in society. If people want to get in touch with you, Sarah, if they're intrigued by your work, maybe want to check out your books and your journal and things, how do they get in touch with you, Sarah?
The easiest is my website, which is happinessiscourage.com.
Perfect. Thank you. Happinessiscourage.com. We'll put that in the show notes for you. It's been a real pleasure. I've got one final question that has two parts that I ask every guest as we wrap up. And it's around curiosity. It's kind of a homage to our first episode back, which was with Dr. Diane Hamilton, who researched curiosity. And the question is, when was the last time you did something for the first time, and what was it?
So about 3 weeks ago, I actually got to hold my very first grandchild for the first time. And although everybody had been telling me my whole life that being a grandparent is the best thing ever, it doesn't even compare to the actual experience. And I am so excited to express my curiosity and teach that little guy about curiosity, because I believe that that is the way to truly find happiness, is to explore and have adventures throughout your life.
Wonderful. I love it. And it filled me up with energy. I've been blessed with, my wife has two older children, and between them they have 6 grandchildren.
That's
so
awesome.
I've had 18 years of beautiful relationship, and the eldest grandson is 17, and the youngest is coming up 1. So I'm with you on that experience and moment, and the desire to, as we do in generations, give the next generation the wisdom, the knowledge, the thought, but also the wings to go and discover something that we didn't know, in that mutual relationship of how we are taught by them and vice versa through life. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to ongoing conversations and collaboration, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Ross. Appreciate the time.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalised report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams and organisations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.